Hi, and welcome back to the online study of preparing for PPA certification. We're on the fourth and final section of cameras, lenses, and attachments, which is section D. Section D says, select and use the appropriate lens attachment. Now there's one item from this section on the test. We're going to talk about several things, but there's going to be one question from this section. So let's get right into it. Number one says, knowledge of lens modifiers, including bellows, hoods, polarizing filters, protective filters, UV filters, vignetting, neutral density and extension tubes, etc. So just about anything that you can attach to a lens or between the lens and the camera. So let's talk about the first couple here. The first couple of lens modifiers have to do with macro or close-up photography, and these are very cool tools. One is called the bellows and the other one is called extension tubes. Bellows are mounted in between the camera and the lens, and they're built on a set of rails so that you can move the lens further out or closer to the film plane through the use of these bellows. And the further out you move that lens, the more closely you're able to focus on very, very small objects. It's variable because of the rails. That makes it a really useful tool for macro photography. Now something very similar to that would be extension tubes. They also are mounted in between the lens and the camera to move that lens further away from the film plane. The difference here is that these are created in sections that you can use in assorted distances. You can stack them together to increase distance, or you can remove some of them to decrease the distance, but they're not quite as flexible and not quite as easy to use as bellows, but they do the very same thing. A lens hood is a device that you put on the front of the lens to help keep stray light from striking the lens and causing lens flare, unwanted lens flare. And there's different types of lens hoods. Here's a lens hood from kind of an older style, but still useful today, used a lot in cinematography, which is again something of a bellows that mounts on the front of the lens but has nothing to do with macro photography. It just has to do with keeping that lens shaded. With this type of lens hood, you're also able to add vignetters or vignettes that are devices that will help darken corners of an image or edges of the photograph. You might even lighten them depending on the type of vignette that you have put on there. But this is kind of old school. Most of the vignetting is done now, of course, inside your image editing software. So now we move into the lens attachments in the class known as filters. Now filters will range from everything from lens protection to color correction or image correction and creative control. So we'll look at several different filters here. We'll see a lot more of these a little bit later on in the study, but we'll just kind of do a real quick run through some of these. We'll begin with the filters that are designed primarily for lens protection. The two most common ones are the skylight filter and the UV haze filter. Now both of these filters absorb ultraviolet light rays, which cause the blue cast to objects and landscapes and things that are way off in the distance of your images. So they help correct that, but not as much as maybe some other filters might, but they do have a use in that area. The main thing is we use them for lens protection. They help keep your lenses protected from scratches and fingerprints and dirt and dust and mist from the ocean and sand and all kinds of other things that would get on your lens and might either damage the lens or would otherwise cause harm to your lens. So it's a lot easier to replace an inexpensive filter than it is to replace a very expensive lens. So we use this class of filter primarily for lens protection. A really useful filter that should be in every photographer's camera bag is called a polarizer. It does a lot of different things, and we'll take a look at some of those things in a moment. It's also important to know that polarizers can be linear or circular, and the circular polarizers are meant to be used with today's digital SLR cameras that use autofocus. A polarizer is something of a screen that is built into the filter, and the filter rotates freely, so that as you rotate the filter on your lens, you can see the results of things happening through the viewfinder that you wouldn't see without having the polarizer on there. So for example, a polarizer can provide increased color saturation and contrast, which is perfect for landscape and scenic images. But you can do some of that in post-production, but man, if you can get it done in the camera, polarizer is the way to go. The other thing that a polarizer will do is reduce surface glare off of water and off of glass. And this is really useful when you are, let's say, copying old photographs, or copying anything that has sort of a reflective surface. That polarizer can help reduce those reflections so that you don't have quite so much glare. Now, it's not going to reduce reflections like from a mirror or a chrome bumper or something like that. We're talking about true reflections that are coming off of the surface of, let's say, the paper, or off of glass. Anything non-metallic, in other words. It can also be used to darken a blue sky to help create additional depth and color value into a sky. And now, to use this, the sun has to be 90 degrees to your left or to the right. The polarizers aren't particularly effective if the sun is behind you or the sun is in front of you. But as long as it's 90 degrees, you'll see really dramatic effects as you turn that polarizer on your lens. And you just kind of turn it until you get the maximum effect. If that's more than you want, you just roll it back a little bit, so there's a little bit of variation in how much you polarize the scene to your liking. Another really useful type of filter is called a neutral density filter, and what this does is it basically takes away some of the lighting that reaches the sensor. In other words, it makes the scene appear darker than it really is. Now, you may think, well, why is that useful? Well, we'll talk about that here in just a second. They come in a variety of filter values, from 1, 2, 4, 8 stops and more. And so if you put a 1-stop neutral density filter on your lens, you're reducing the overall exposure by 1 stop. If you put a 4-stop neutral density filter on your lens, you're reducing that exposure by 4 stops. So why would you want to do this? Well, here's a great example. Let's say we're going to be photographing a waterfall, and you want to record that waterfall with the really slow shutter speed, so you get that smooth, silky, almost cotton candy look to the water, but you've got a fairly bright day that you're photographing under. So when it's bright outside, it's hard to get down to slower shutter speeds. If your lens only goes to f/22 or f/32, you might not be able to get a slow enough shutter speed to slow that shutter down in order to record that kind of movement and record that water the way you want. So by putting on a 4-stop neutral density filter, you're taking whatever the existing exposure is and you're reducing that exposure by 4 additional stops. So it could be the difference between photographing at, let's say, 1/15 of a second or down to 1 second. So a 4-stop filter or a neutral density filter really will help in those situations where you want to really draw out movement or creative effects through slow shutter speeds by reducing that overall exposure. There's also graduated neutral density filters where just the top half of the filter has the neutral density effect and the bottom part of it is clear, and you say, well, why would you want to do that? Well, the perfect example there would be when you're photographing where you want the foreground exposed in a certain way, but the sky is really, really bright. So if you use a graduated neutral density filter, you can properly expose for the foreground, and the neutral density part of the filter takes care of darkening the sky for you. And again, you have your choice of darkening it by 1 stop, 2 stops, 4 stops, or more. So these are really useful filters, and again, might be a cool tool to have in your camera bag. Close-up filters help you create more of a macro effect with your lens by putting the filter on the front, and that filter in turn will magnify whatever is in front of the lens. So again, you have multiple values for close-up filters. You might have a +1, a +2, a +4. These filters can be stacked to increase the magnification. And so they're helpful for a lot of environments. They're probably not going to be quite as effective as the bellows or the extension tubes, but they're a lot less expensive, and as long as you're not needing to get extremely close, they can be really helpful in doing some close-up work. You also have color correction filters, or CC filters. These filters would be in place for when you encounter different lighting situations, such as tungsten light or fluorescent light, and those sorts of things. Most of the time nowadays we do those corrections in the camera by setting the white balance, or we shoot in RAW and we do those corrections in image editing. But those filters are still relevant, and there's a couple in particular that we might talk about. One would be the fluorescent filters, the FLDs or the FLWs. FLD is used for daylight balanced fluorescent tubes, because fluorescent tubes have their own color temperature as well, where FLW is for warm light balanced fluorescent tubes. If you'll go back to Home Depot, or the next time you're back in Home Depot or Lowe's, go into the fluorescent lighting section and look at the various colors of fluorescent tubes. So it's obvious you can't just color correct for fluorescent tubes. You have to color correct for the type of fluorescent tube, and those two filters are good examples of how to correct for various fluorescent tubes. Let's also talk about the color corrective filters that convert tungsten light to daylight. That's again something we would probably do in camera, and maybe we would fine tune it by shooting in RAW and dealing with it in post-production, but these are still relatively useful filters even with digital photography. The 80A or the 80B filters convert tungsten light into daylight balance. The 80A is for lights with a color temperature of 3200, and the 80B is for 3400K photo flood lights. So now a lot of photographers will use hot lights in their studio environment, and you could use these filters and save yourself maybe some degree of processing time by knowing what the color value is of your lamps, using the appropriate filter, and then fine-tuning once again that editing in post-production. They do absorb a lot of light, so they cost you a couple of stops to use. That's why I think that they're not particularly useful in today's modern digital photography, because even tungsten lights aren't that bright to begin with, and when you're reducing the exposure by another stop or two, that can be quite a lot in a studio environment. The 81A, 81B, and 81C are in a class of warming filters which may be used to offset bluish overtones that are often present with overcast lighting or with portable flash. Again, we don't see these very often in digital photography. This is a post-production decision, but it's good to know these filters and what they're used for. Well, that's the end of section D, which is the final section of cameras, lenses, and attachments. There's 12 questions on the exam from this entire section of cameras, lenses, and attachments. So go back, read through the materials, rewatch the videos if you need to. But I think a little bit of time spent on this, you'll have everything you need to know to be prepared for the exam. And I'll be looking forward to seeing you on the next section of preparing for PPA certification.